The war had already swallowed half the nation when Union Commander Nathaniel Hawthorne arrived at Camp Ridgewood, a windswept stretch of muddy tents and cannon smoke along the Tennessee border. He was 38, hardened by battle, with a reputation for winning impossible fights and losing everyone he loved. Soldiers whispered that he carried death with him like a shadow, and perhaps they were right. On the morning she arrived, he noticed her before he knew her name. She stood among a group of volunteer nurses stepping down from a wagon, skirts dusted with travel dirt, posture too calm for a woman stepping into a war camp. Her hair was pinned beneath a modest bonnet, her eyes steady, measuring everything. She looked less like a nurse and more like someone who had memorized the world and decided which parts to reveal. Her name was Miss Eleanor Whitfield. She claimed to be from Kentucky, with training from a small medical school and a heart determined to help the wounded. The Army needed nurses desperately, so no one questioned her. Except Nathaniel Hawthorne. He had spent his life reading men before they fired, sensing lies before they reached the lips. Eleanor moved with purpose, but never fear. She listened more than she spoke. She remembered names and ranks after hearing them once. She walked through the camp as if mapping it in her mind. That was when he knew. She was not just a nurse. 2 nights after her arrival, Nathaniel received a coded report from military intelligence. Confederate spies had infiltrated Union camps disguised as nurses, teachers, even widows. One name was mentioned as a suspected operative, Eleanor Whitfield. He folded the paper and burned it in the lantern flame without telling anyone. For reasons he did not yet understand, he wanted her secret to remain his. He summoned her to his tent the next evening under the pretense of assigning medical duties. The lantern cast flickering shadows on the canvas walls, and outside soldiers sang rough songs to drown out the memory of the day's casualties. She stood straight, hands folded, waiting. "Miss Whitfield," he said, studying her as if she were a battlefield. "You do not seem afraid." She met his eyes. "Fear does not help the wounded, Commander." He leaned forward. "Or the spies." Her expression barely changed, but something sharpened in her gaze. "If you believe I am a spy," she said quietly, "then you should arrest me." He watched her for a long moment, then sat back. "I believe you are very intelligent," he said, "and very careful, which makes you dangerous." She did not deny it. She only said, "War makes everyone dangerous." Instead of ordering her arrest, he gave her full access to the wounded wards, even the officers' tents. He watched her closely, waiting for her to slip. She never did. Weeks passed. Battles came and went. Nathaniel wrote letters to families of men who would never return home. Eleanor stitched wounds, whispered prayers, and held dying soldiers' hands as they took their last breath. She never cried. She never faltered. But sometimes, when she thought no one watched, she stared into the night as if she carried 1,000 regrets inside her chest. Their conversations grew longer. She spoke of rivers and farms, of a childhood filled with horses and quiet fields. He spoke of the academy, of dreams of becoming a teacher before the war changed everything. They never spoke of allegiance, never spoke of the sides that were tearing the nation apart. One evening, after a brutal skirmish that left hundreds wounded, Nathaniel collapsed onto a wooden crate outside the medical tent. Eleanor sat beside him, hands stained with blood. "You could have been anything," she said softly. "So could you," he replied. She looked at him with something that felt like sorrow. "You know who I am?" she whispered. "Yes." "Why haven't you turned me in?" He stared across the camp at the flickering lanterns and tired men. "Because," he said, "I'm tired of losing everything." She nodded, as if she understood too well. From that night, the line between them vanished. They walked the camp together in silence, sharing bread and bitter coffee. She told him of her father, a man who believed the South's cause was holy. He told her of his mother, who believed no cause was worth burying sons. They did not touch, but the distance between them grew unbearable. One night, rain hammered the camp, turning roads into rivers. Eleanor arrived at his tent, soaked, breathless, eyes blazing. "They are moving troops at dawn," she said. "If I send word, your men will die." "And if you don't," he said, "your people will." She stared at him, then whispered, "I don't want anyone to die anymore." He reached for her hand. She did not pull away. In that moment, the war felt far away. They began a secret life inside a world of death. Meetings in quiet corners, conversations whispered in candlelight, glances that said everything they dared not speak. He never reported her. She never sent a message. Both betrayed their sides in silence. Months later, rumors began spreading in the camp. A Confederate spy was suspected. Military investigators arrived, questioning nurses and officers alike. Nathaniel knew the clock was running out. One evening, Eleanor came to him trembling. "They are getting closer," she whispered. "If they discover me—" "They won't," he said, though he knew that was a lie. She took his hand and pressed it to her stomach. "I'm with child." The world stopped. He stared at her, unable to breathe. In a war that killed sons by the thousands, he had created a life. "They can never know," she whispered. "If they do, they will hang me and ruin you." He pulled her into his arms. For the first time, she cried. Outside, cannons thundered in the distance. Inside, two enemies became something more dangerous than traitors. They became family, and they knew the army would never forgive them. If you want to hear how the Union commander planned to fake her death and save their unborn child, like this story, subscribe and comment your thoughts. Your support helps bring these hidden frontier legends to life. The knowledge that she carried his child changed Nathaniel Hawthorne in ways he could not explain. The war no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like a trap closing in around a secret that could destroy them both. Every footstep outside his tent sounded like an investigator coming to drag her away. Every knock on the medical ward door felt like the end. Eleanor tried to remain the composed nurse the men admired, but the weight of her secret was written in the way her hand sometimes trembled when she tied bandages, in the way she avoided strong smells that turned her pale, in the quiet moments when she pressed a hand against her abdomen, as if reminding herself that something gentle still existed in a brutal world. Nathaniel began to plan. He had spent his life planning battles, how to outmaneuver cavalry, how to read artillery lines, how to break an enemy charge. But this was different. This was not about winning territory. This was about saving a woman who had become more important than his rank, his reputation, and even his allegiance. The military investigators arrived in force. They were men with cold eyes and paperwork thick with suspicion. They questioned every nurse, every officer, every messenger. They watched Eleanor carefully, noting her accent, her memory, her intelligence. One of them, Major Collins, was especially sharp. He had once served in counterintelligence in Washington and had a reputation for breaking spies with polite conversation. "She's too calm," Collins said one evening as he walked with Nathaniel along the muddy perimeter of the camp. "Real nurses break under this work. She doesn't." "She's strong," Nathaniel replied. "So were half the Confederate agents we executed," Collins said lightly. That night, Nathaniel knew time was running out. He visited Eleanor in the medical tent after midnight, when only a few exhausted nurses remained. She sat on a stool, staring at a lantern flame as if it were a future she could no longer see. "They suspect me," she said without looking up. "They always have." "I know. Major Collins asked me about Kentucky towns that no longer exist," she whispered. "He watches how I walk, how I speak. He is waiting for me to slip." Nathaniel knelt beside her. "You won't slip," he said. "But you will," she said, meeting his eyes. They are watching you too. A Union commander protecting a suspected spy is suspicious. Loving her is treason. He did not deny it. I have an idea, he said quietly. Her eyes narrowed. Tell me. He leaned closer so only she could hear. We make them believe you are dead. Silence filled the tent, broken only by the distant coughs of wounded soldiers. Dead? She repeated. Yes. A tragedy, a fever, an accident, something believable in wartime. The army buries its dead quickly. They won't question a corpse. And then you disappear. I arrange for you to be transferred to a civilian camp under another name. You leave the war. You live. Our child lives. She stared at him, stunned. They will suspect foul play, she whispered. They will grieve, he said. They always grieve. Then they move on. War makes grief ordinary. She looked down at her stomach. I don't want to be a ghost, she said softly. I don't want our child to grow up without knowing who I am. They will know you, he said. Just not the world. She hesitated, then nodded slowly. Then we must be perfect, she said. The plan began to form in whispers and shadows. Nathaniel had influence over supply chains, hospital records, and transport manifests. He knew which officers would sign documents without reading them, which doctors would follow orders without question. He knew which graves would never be visited. He arranged for Eleanor to be listed among the casualties of a sudden outbreak of camp fever that had already taken dozens of men. He spoke to the chief surgeon privately, telling him Eleanor had been exposed and was deteriorating quickly. The surgeon, exhausted and overwhelmed, signed the papers. Next came the performance. Eleanor began acting sick. She coughed when others were near, stayed in her cot, refused meals. Rumors spread that the beautiful nurse had caught the deadly fever. Soldiers whispered prayers for her. Some brought flowers stolen from fields miles away. Major Collins visited her bedside. You were a fine nurse, he said, studying her pale face. Shame if the war takes you too. She forced a weak smile. The war takes everyone, Major. He watched her for a long moment, then left. Nathaniel stood outside the tent that night, listening to the wind and the distant artillery, knowing that tomorrow she would officially die. The morning arrived gray and cold. The surgeon pronounced her dead after she drank a carefully measured sleeping draught that slowed her pulse enough to mimic death. Nathaniel had bribed an undertaker with whiskey and promises to keep the burial simple and quick. They wrapped her in a plain cloth and carried her to a shallow grave outside the camp. Soldiers stood silently as she was lowered into the earth. Nathaniel stood among them, face expressionless, heart shattering. Major Collins nodded solemnly. Another soul lost. They covered the coffin with dirt and moved on. That night, under cover of darkness, Nathaniel and a trusted sergeant returned to the grave. They dug quietly, hands blistered, breath fogging in the cold air. They lifted the coffin and carried it to a waiting wagon. Inside, Eleanor opened her eyes. She was alive. The sergeant looked away, pretending not to see. They drove through the forest for hours, away from the camp, away from suspicion, toward a civilian settlement where Nathaniel had arranged a false identity for her. Mrs. Eleanor Hart, a war widow traveling to distant relatives. Before dawn, Nathaniel stopped the wagon. He climbed inside and held her hand. "This is goodbye," he whispered. "For now," she said. He kissed her forehead. "I will find you when this war ends." "If it ends," she whispered. He watched as the wagon rolled away, carrying the woman he loved and the child he had never expected. Back at camp, he returned to duty as if nothing had happened. But Major Collins was not convinced. He reviewed Eleanor's records, her letters, her origins. Something bothered him. She had died too conveniently, too quietly. He began questioning Nathaniel more aggressively. "You were close to the nurse," Collins said one afternoon. "She treated wounded men, Nathaniel replied. "So did many others. You requested her burial to be expedited. The fever was contagious. You attended the burial. I attend many burials." Collins leaned closer. "You're hiding something, Commander." Nathaniel met his gaze. "I hide nothing that would harm the Union," he said. But Collins was not satisfied. He sent scouts to search nearby civilian camps for suspicious women traveling alone. He checked transport logs. He questioned wagon drivers. For weeks, Nathaniel lived in constant fear that Eleanor would be found. Meanwhile, Eleanor traveled under false papers, moving from town to town, hiding her pregnancy beneath thick dresses. She worked briefly as a midwife in small settlements, using her skills to survive. People called her a blessing, unaware that she was a ghost the army believed buried. She wrote letters to Nathaniel using coded phrases in newspapers, speaking of weather and crops that meant more. "I am well. The spring is strong. The seed grows." He read every word as if it were scripture. But fate did not allow peace. Months later, a Confederate agent was captured with documents listing known spies, including Eleanor Whitfield. The army realized they had buried a Confederate operative under their noses. Major Collins confronted Nathaniel in his tent. "You lied," Collins said coldly. "She was a spy." Nathaniel did not deny it. "She is dead," he said. "We buried the wrong enemy," Collins replied. "And you helped her." Nathaniel knew then that his career was over. He faced court-martial for negligence, possibly treason. His reputation shattered. Men who once admired him avoided him. Some whispered he had loved the enemy. He did not care. All he cared about was whether Eleanor and the child were safe. And far away in a quiet valley, Eleanor went into labor alone, assisted by a kind farmer's wife who never asked questions. As dawn broke over the mountains, a child cried into the world, a child born of a Union commander and a Confederate spy, a child who would never know war if Nathaniel could help it. The court-martial was swift, public, and merciless. Nathaniel Hawthorne stood before a panel of generals who had once toasted him in candlelit tents and praised him as the Union's most disciplined commander. Now they stared at him as if he were a contagion, something to be contained before it spread. The charges were spoken clearly, each word a hammer striking his name into history as something tarnished. Negligence in intelligence matters. Failure to report a known Confederate spy, conduct unbecoming of a Union officer, possible treasonous sympathies. Nathaniel listened in silence, his hands folded behind his back, his uniform spotless, his heart already somewhere far from the courtroom. He did not defend himself. He did not explain that love had guided his betrayal, that a child had been saved from a life of bloodshed because he had broken the rules of war. He knew such explanations would sound like madness to men who had buried sons and brothers in shallow graves. Major Collins testified with calm precision. He described Eleanor Whitfield as a highly trained Confederate operative who had likely gathered intelligence before her death. He suggested Nathaniel's behavior had been suspicious from the beginning, that his affection had clouded his duty. She was the enemy, Collins concluded. He chose her over the Union. Nathaniel did not argue. He had. The verdict was delivered with military efficiency. He was stripped of command, reduced in rank, and reassigned to a non-combatant logistical post far from the front lines. Some generals had argued for imprisonment, others argued for execution, but his past victories and the lack of direct proof that he had aided Confederate operations saved his life. Saved his life, but destroyed his legacy. As he left the courtroom, soldiers avoided his gaze. Some spat on the ground. Others whispered his name with contempt. To many, he had become a cautionary tale, the commander who loved the enemy. He accepted it. Because somewhere beyond the reach of the army, Eleanor and their child lived. He clung to that knowledge like a drowning man clings to driftwood. He wrote to her through coded advertisements in obscure newspapers, never signing his name, never revealing his location. "The river is quiet. The bridge still stands." She responded in kind. "The valley is green. The traveler rests." He interpreted every phrase with obsession, mapping her movements across the countryside. When he was finally discharged from active service, he did not return to Washington or to any city that remembered him as a hero. Instead, he took what little money he had and began traveling west, following the faint trail of her messages, crossing rivers, valleys, and ruined towns that the war had emptied of men. He traveled on horseback through quiet farms where widows plowed fields alone. He slept in taverns where soldiers drank to forget what they had done. He listened to rumors of a skilled healer traveling under the name Eleanor Hart, a woman who cured fevers, delivered babies, and refused to speak of her past. Each rumor felt like a breadcrumb leading him closer to redemption. Meanwhile, Eleanor lived a life of quiet exile. She had settled in a small valley town, nestled between rolling hills and thick forests, a place too insignificant for the army to care about and too far from the front lines for anyone to question her origins. She worked as a midwife and healer, using her knowledge to save lives instead of destroy them. The townspeople called her blessed. They called her Miracle Woman. They brought her bread and milk and stories. They asked no questions. She named the child Samuel. He had Nathaniel's dark eyes and her quiet intensity. He grew quickly, strong and curious, crawling across wooden floors and laughing at birds through the window. Eleanor watched him with both joy and fear. She knew that one day he would ask about his father, about his past, about why they lived as ghosts in a borrowed town. She did not know what she would tell him. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, a stranger rode into town. He wore a worn Union coat with the insignia removed. His posture was military, his face older than his years, his eyes scanning every building as if searching for something he had lost. Eleanor saw him from her window. Her heart stopped. Nathaniel dismounted near the general store and asked for directions to a midwife named Eleanor Hart. The shopkeeper pointed toward her house, adding, "She's the best healer we got. Saved my boy from pneumonia last winter." Nathaniel walked slowly as if approaching a battlefield. When he knocked, Eleanor opened the door. For a moment, neither spoke. Years of war, secrets, and longing collapsed into silence. "You're alive," he whispered. "So are you," she replied. He stepped inside, and Samuel toddled across the floor, staring at the stranger with wide eyes. "That is him," Eleanor said softly. Nathaniel knelt, his hands shaking. "Samuel." The boy touched his face, then laughed. Nathaniel felt something inside him break open, a joy so painful it felt like grief. They sat together long into the night. Eleanor told him of her travels, of hiding, of the fear that soldiers might one day arrive and drag her away. Nathaniel told her of the trial, the disgrace, the loneliness, and the decision to find her no matter the cost. "They think you are dead," he said. "They must continue to think that," she replied. He nodded. "I will live as a civilian. No uniform, no past, just a man." She looked at him with a sadness that felt like love. "We have already betrayed everything," she said. "We must betray nothing else." For a brief season they lived as a family. Nathaniel built a small fence around the house. Eleanor worked in the town. Samuel learned to walk in the grass and speak his first words beside the hearth. They laughed. They cooked together. They lived as if the world had forgiven them. But the world never forgives. Major Collins had not forgotten. After the war ended, he continued his career in federal intelligence, tasked with tracking former Confederate agents. When he came across documents about Eleanor Whitfield, something in his memory stirred. The nurse who died too conveniently, the commander who had loved her too deeply. He began investigating rumors of a healer traveling west. He found reports. A woman matching her description had been seen in several towns. A child had been born around the time of her supposed death. A former Union commander had disappeared from records and was rumored to be traveling the same region. Collins mounted a quiet investigation. He hired bounty men, former soldiers with nothing to lose and a taste for justice or revenge. He sent letters to sheriffs asking about a woman named Eleanor Hart and a former officer named Nathaniel Hawthorne. The noose began to tighten. One evening, Nathaniel returned home to find Eleanor tense, her hands trembling as she folded cloth. "A man asked about me today," she said. "He had the look of the army." Nathaniel felt the old fear return. "We must move," he said. "But Samuel, he will move with us." They began packing that night, but fate moved faster than they did. The bounty men arrived before dawn. They surrounded the house quietly, rifles raised, horses snorting in the cold air. Nathaniel woke to the sound of boots on gravel. He looked through the window and saw shadows circling the home. He woke Eleanor and whispered, "They found us." She clutched Samuel to her chest. "What do we do?" He grabbed his old revolver, the same one he had carried through countless battles. "We run," he said. They slipped out the back door into the woods, moving through the trees as dawn painted the sky red. Samuel cried softly, confused by the urgency. Eleanor whispered to him, trying to calm him. Shots rang out. A bullet tore through a tree trunk inches from Nathaniel's head. "Stop!" a man shouted. "In the name of the United States government!" Nathaniel fired back, not to kill, but to slow them. He led Eleanor and Samuel toward a narrow ravine where the terrain would slow horses. They ran for hours, stumbling through underbrush, crossing streams, climbing rocky slopes. Finally, exhausted, they reached a cave high in the hills, a place Nathaniel had seen on his travels. They hid inside, listening to dogs bark in the distance. Eleanor held Samuel, tears streaming down her face. "I thought we were free," she whispered. "We will be," Nathaniel said, though he no longer knew if it was true. Outside, the world searched for them. Inside, a family hid from a nation that would never understand them. And in the darkness of that cave, Nathaniel realized something terrifying. Love had saved them from the war, but love might not save them from peace. The cave smelled of damp stone and old earth, a forgotten wound in the mountain where time itself seemed to hide. Nathaniel sat near the entrance, listening to the distant echoes of dogs and men shouting through the forested valley. Eleanor sat deeper inside, rocking Samuel against her chest, whispering songs her mother had once sung before the world had split itself in two. The child did not understand why they were hiding, why his father's voice had turned to whispers, why his mother's eyes reflected fear instead of sunlight. He only knew that the man and woman he loved were close, and that the world outside felt dangerous. Nathaniel had known battlefields. He had known artillery barrages that turned soil into fire and men into ghosts. But this was worse. This was a hunt, and he was the hunted. They remained in the cave for 2 days, living on dried bread and water Nathaniel had carried. At night, Eleanor pressed her ear to the stone walls, listening for footsteps. Samuel slept in short bursts, waking often, sensing the tension like an animal senses storms. On the third morning, Nathaniel saw smoke rising from the valley. The bounty men had found the town. They were asking questions. They were following the trail. "They will not stop," Eleanor whispered. "They will," Nathaniel said, "one way or another." She looked at him with a knowing sadness. "You mean death?" He did not answer. The men arrived before sunset. Nathaniel heard the crunch of boots on gravel outside the cave, the scrape of metal on stone as a rifle barrel brushed the entrance. He stepped forward slowly, hands raised, revolver tucked into his belt. A man in a worn federal coat stood at the entrance, flanked by 2 bounty hunters. Behind them, on horseback, sat Major Collins. Collins looked older, his hair streaked with gray, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. "Well," Collins said, dismounting, "it seems the dead nurse lives." Nathaniel stepped outside. "You should not have come," he said. Collins smiled thinly. "You should not have loved the enemy." The bounty men entered the cave and dragged Eleanor out. Samuel clutched to her chest. She did not resist. She only held the child tighter. "So this is the child," Collins said, studying Samuel. "A Union commander and a Confederate spy, a walking contradiction." "He is innocent," Nathaniel said. "So were many men before they chose a side," Collins replied. Collins ordered the men to bind Nathaniel's hands. They tied Eleanor's wrists loosely, but she did not struggle. She knew resistance would only endanger Samuel. They rode back toward the town, the sky bleeding red and gold over the hills. The townspeople gathered in silence, watching as the healer they had loved returned in chains. Some cried, some looked away. Some stared in shock, unable to reconcile the woman who had delivered their children with the label of spy. Collins addressed the crowd. "This woman," he said, "is Eleanor Whitfield, a Confederate agent who infiltrated Union camps. She was reported dead. She was not. This man is Nathaniel Hawthorne, former Union commander, who aided her escape and committed treason." A murmur spread through the crowd. "She saved my wife," one farmer said quietly. "She saved my boy," another said. "She never hurt anyone here," a third whispered. Collins ignored them. "We will escort them to federal authorities," he said. "They will stand trial. The child will be taken into government custody." At those words, Eleanor screamed. "No," she shouted, "you will not take him." Nathaniel struggled against his bonds. "He has nothing to do with this." Collins raised a hand, silencing them. "He is evidence," Collins said, "and history does not like evidence that contradicts its stories." They were placed in a small wooden jail in the town. Samuel was allowed to stay with Eleanor for the night, but guards stood outside the door. Inside the dim cell, Nathaniel and Eleanor sat on a wooden bench, Samuel asleep between them. "This is the end," Eleanor whispered. "No," Nathaniel said. "This is a battle, and I have won battles with worse odds." She smiled sadly. "You always believed in victory." "And you?" "I believe in survival." He looked at her. "We will survive." She touched his face. "Promise me something," she said. "Anything. If they come for him, if they try to take him away, you must run. Even if I cannot." He shook his head. "I will not leave you." "You must," she said firmly. "He deserves a life without chains, without whispers, without soldiers knocking at his door." Nathaniel stared at their child, the soft rise and fall of his chest. "I will not let them take him," he said. Outside, Collins sat with the town sheriff, sipping coffee. "She healed half this town," the sheriff said. "People will not like what happens next." "They don't have to like it," Collins replied. "They only have to forget it." The trial was scheduled for the following week in a nearby city. Until then, they were to be held under guard. But Collins underestimated the town. That night, several townspeople gathered outside the jail. They whispered among themselves, arguing. "She saved my wife," one said again. "She delivered my daughter," another said. "She is not a spy to us," a third said. They approached the sheriff. "Let her go," a farmer said. "She belongs here." The sheriff shook his head. "This is federal business." "So was the war," the farmer replied, "and we are tired of wars." The sheriff hesitated. He had lost 2 sons to the war. He had buried friends and cousins and neighbors. He had watched politicians argue while men died. He looked at the jail. "Give me time," he said. Inside the cell, Eleanor felt the tension in the air. She knew the town was divided. She knew Collins would not back down. "They will make an example of us," she whispered to Nathaniel. "Then we must give them a story they cannot erase," he replied. He had been thinking. Collins believed in narratives. He believed in history written by winners. Nathaniel had spent years understanding how men in power thought. "They buried you once," he said. "They believed it." She stared at him. "You want to do it again?" He nodded. "This time, for real." She understood immediately. Her eyes widened, then filled with tears. "No," she whispered. "It is the only way," he said. "They will never stop hunting you. They will never stop hunting Samuel. But if you die, truly die, they will stop." "And you?" she asked. "I will disappear again." "But they will not care about a disgraced former commander. They will care about the spy." She shook her head violently. "You are asking me to die. I am asking you to save our son." Silence filled the cell. Samuel stirred, murmuring in his sleep. "I am tired of running," she whispered. "I am tired of hiding." "So am I," he said. "But this is the last hiding place." She looked at their child, then back at Nathaniel. "I never wanted to be a hero," she said. "You already are," he replied. The next morning, the town awoke to chaos. A fire had broken out at the edge of the town in an old storage barn near the jail. People rushed to extinguish it. Guards were distracted. Smoke filled the air. Inside the jail, the sheriff opened the cell door. "You didn't hear this from me," he said. "You have 1 hour." Nathaniel stared at him. "Why?" he asked. The sheriff looked away. "Because my wife is alive because of her." They fled through the back of the jail, carrying Samuel, disappearing into the smoke and confusion. They ran into the forest, heading toward the river. But Collins was not fooled. He had anticipated such an attempt. He and his men tracked them through the woods, using dogs and scouts. At the riverbank, Nathaniel and Eleanor stopped. The river was wide and fast. There was no boat. "They will catch us," Eleanor whispered. Nathaniel looked at the water, then at her. "This is where it ends," he said. She understood. They built a small raft from logs and rope, just enough to carry Samuel. "They will believe you drowned," Nathaniel said. "They will find your belongings. They will assume the river took you." "And you?" she asked. "I will cross later, or I will vanish." She kissed him. "I loved you," she said. "I love you," he corrected. They placed Samuel on the raft, wrapped in cloth. "You must go," she whispered to him. He did not understand, but he reached for her. She pushed the raft into the current. Nathaniel watched as the child drifted away, toward a bend in the river where the current would carry him to safety. Then he turned to Eleanor. "They are coming," he said. She nodded. "Then we must make it believable." They walked into the water together. Shots rang out from the forest as Collins and his men arrived. Nathaniel fired back, shouting, "They are in the river." Collins watched through binoculars as Eleanor was swept under by the current. Nathaniel disappeared into the trees, wounded but alive. The river carried Eleanor away, or so they believed. In truth, she had tied herself to a hidden rope that led to a downstream bank where a sympathetic farmer waited. She emerged, gasping, alive, but unseen. Collins recovered Eleanor's belongings from the shore. "She is dead," he said. "Again." He wrote the report himself. The Confederate spy, Eleanor Whitfield, drowned while fleeing federal custody. Her child was presumed lost. Nathaniel Hawthorne escaped, but was believed wounded and likely dead. History closed the book, but history was wrong. Far downstream, Samuel was found by a couple who had lost their own child in the war. They raised him as their own, unaware of his origins. Eleanor traveled further west under another name, working as a healer again. Nathaniel vanished into the frontier, searching for them both. The war had ended, but their story had just begun.